The chains hummed against Eli Thorne's wrists with a frequency that made his teeth ache. He'd been wearing them for 6 hours now, ever since the enforcers had pulled him out of his bunk on the cargo hauler and informed him that his presence was required at the Helix Tribunal. Required was such a polite word for what amounted to being dragged across 3 docking rings in your underwear before someone had the decency to throw a jumpsuit at you. The corridor stretched ahead like the gullet of some massive creature, all bioluminescent panels and curved walls that seemed to breathe. Eli had been to the Helix before, of course. Every independent hauler working the outer lanes had to pass through at least once a year to renew their transit permits. But he'd never been in this section, where the walls were darker and the air tasted like recycled fear. His guards were Ketheric, which was just his luck. 7 feet of chitinous armor and about as chatty as a brick. The one on his left had a translator pin on his thorax, but he hadn't said a word since they'd left the detention level. Eli had tried making conversation at first. Asked about the weather, which was a stupid joke since they were in a space station. Commented on the lovely ambience of the corridor. Wondered aloud if the tribunal had a gift shop because his nephew's birthday was coming up and nothing says happy birthday like a snow globe from an interstellar courthouse. The Ketheric on his right had responded by tightening the chains until Eli's hands went numb. So now he walked in silence, watching the other species that filled the Helix's arteries. A family of Quellan drifted past in their environment suits, their gaseous forms swirling with what might have been curiosity or might have been indigestion. A pack of Terralian merchants argued in their clicking language, mandibles clacking against each other in what passed for aggressive negotiation. Everywhere he looked, aliens. Dozens of species, hundreds of individuals, and not a single human face among them. That was the thing about being human these days. You were always alone in a crowd. The Fringe Wars had ended 3 years ago with Earth's unconditional surrender, and humanity had learned a hard lesson about its place in the galaxy. Turned out, when you're the new species on the block and you start shooting at your neighbors because you don't like their trade policies, those neighbors eventually band together and slap you down hard enough that you see stars. Literally. Now humans were permitted to exist in the galactic community under about 1,000 restrictions, none of which Eli had bothered to memorize because he'd been trying very hard to stay out of trouble. He ran legal cargo. Well, mostly legal. The occasional unregistered medical supplies to colony worlds didn't count because nobody was getting hurt and somebody's kid was getting vaccinated. But sabotaging a diplomatic vessel? That was about 17 leagues beyond his moral flexibility. The guard steered him around a corner and the corridor opened into a massive atrium. Eli's breath caught despite himself. The Helix Tribunal proper rose above them like a monument to bureaucratic intimidation. The structure defied simple geometry, all impossible angles and surfaces that seemed to exist in more dimensions than his brain wanted to process. Streams of light flowed through crystalline conduits embedded in the walls, carrying data in pulses that looked almost alive. Jump gate technology he understood. Neural interfaces made sense. But whatever architectural nightmare had spawned this place was beyond him. They crossed the atrium floor, and Eli became aware of the stairs. A Voshan diplomat paused mid-conversation to watch him pass, her crystalline eyes tracking his movement with the cold interest of someone observing a particularly pathetic insect. A group of what looked like students. If students could be 8-limbed and covered in sensory tendrils, pointed and whispered among themselves. Right. Because humans were still a novelty. The species that thought it could punch above its weight and got knocked flat for its trouble. Eli wanted to wave, maybe take a bow, really play into the spectacle. But his hands were still chained and his guards probably wouldn't appreciate the humor. Besides, he was starting to get genuinely nervous, which annoyed him. Fear was supposed to come later, after he'd exhausted all his other options. The main doors of the courtroom loomed ahead, each one 50 feet high and inscribed with symbols from 100 different languages. The Ketheric on his left finally spoke, his translator pin rendering the clicks and chirps into flat standard. You will remain silent unless addressed directly by the magistrates. You will not attempt to flee. You will accept the judgment of the assembly. Eli nodded. Got it. Silence, no running, except soul-crushing verdict. Any chance I can get these chains adjusted? I'm losing feeling in my fingers and I'd like to have full motor control when I inevitably need to sign my own death warrant. The guard's antennae twitched, which might have been amusement or might have been the Ketheric equivalent of rolling his eyes. Hard to tell with giant space bugs. The doors began to open with a sound like distant thunder, and light spilled out from the chamber beyond. Eli caught a glimpse of the assembly inside, tier upon tier of seats rising into shadows, each one occupied by a representative of the great species. The air that rolled out carried the scent of ozone and something else, something that reminded him of the moments before a storm breaks. His heart was hammering now, and his mouth had gone dry. 3 years of keeping his head down, of following the rules, of being the model reformed human just trying to make an honest living. And it was going to end here, in front of a court that had decided his guilt before he'd even arrived. The Ketheric guards pushed him forward, and Eli Thorne, cargo hauler and apparently accused saboteur, walked into the courtroom to face judgment from beings who had already made up their minds. The last coherent thought he managed before the weight of all those alien eyes fell upon him was that at least the chains had stopped humming. Small mercies. The courtroom swallowed Eli whole. That was the only way to describe it, really. The circular chamber stretched upward into darkness, tier after tier of seats carved into the walls like the inside of some vast amphitheater designed by someone with a grudge against human comfort. Every seat was occupied, and every occupant was staring at him. The Ketheric guards deposited him in the center of the floor, where a circle of light marked his designated spot like a target. Then they retreated to the perimeter, leaving him alone under what felt like 1,000 eyes. More than 1,000, actually, if you counted species with multiple visual organs. The Korvathi representative in the third tier had at least 6, all of them tracking Eli's movements independently. He tried not to think about that. A holographic display materialized in front of him, cycling through text in languages he couldn't read before settling on standard. The words hung in the air at eye level: Elias Thorne, human, registry code H7749-3821, you stand accused. Well, at least they'd gotten his name right. Last time he'd been arrested, on Mars Station for that bar fight that technically wasn't his fault, they'd listed him as Elvis Throne in the official report. He'd kept the document as a souvenir. A sound like a gong vibrated through the chamber, deep enough that Eli felt it in his chest. The crowd noise that had been a dull murmur died instantly. From the highest tier, nearly invisible in the shadows, a voice spoke. The translator in Eli's ear rendered it as neutral and male, but he suspected the original sounded nothing like that. The tribunal recognizes the case against the human Elias Thorne. The prosecution may present evidence. Another figure emerged from the tiers, gliding down on some kind of personal gravity platform. Eli couldn't tell what species it was at first. Bipedal, roughly humanoid in shape, but covered in what looked like living metal that shifted and flowed across its surface. When it spoke, the voice was perfectly modulated, utterly devoid of emotion. The evidence is conclusive. On the 4th rotation of the previous lunar cycle, the diplomatic vessel Serenity's crown was destroyed while in transit to the Korvax Peace Summit. All 17 delegates aboard were killed. Analysis of the explosion signature indicates the use of a Mark 7 plasma charge, smuggled aboard during a cargo transfer. The holographic display shifted, and suddenly Eli was staring at his own ship. The Drifter's Luck, his home for the past 3 years, looking small and battered next to the sleek diplomatic vessel. The timestamp showed it was from 2 weeks ago. The accused vessel, the prosecutor continued, made contact with Serenity's crown exactly 19 hours before the explosion. Cargo manifest indicates a shipment of medical supplies. However, our investigation reveals that one container was never logged by the crown's receiving crew. More images. His ship docking. Cargo containers being transferred. And then, damning and clear, a red outline around one particular crate as it moved from the Drifter's Luck into the diplomatic vessel's hold. Eli's stomach dropped. He opened his mouth to object, to explain that he delivered exactly what was on his manifest, that he'd never even been inside the Crown's cargo bay personally. But the holographic text in front of him pulsed red: silence. You will speak only when permitted. Right. Because due process was apparently negotiable when you were human. The prosecutor gestured and the display changed again. This time it showed sensor logs, streams of data that Eli couldn't fully parse but recognized as jump gate signatures. His ship's identification codes were highlighted, tracked through 3 different gate transitions in the days leading up to the explosion. The accused movement pattern is consistent with someone establishing alibis. He made numerous stops, ensured his presence was recorded at multiple stations, creating the appearance of routine cargo operations. A calculated attempt to establish plausible deniability. Or, Eli thought bitterly, the movement pattern of someone actually running routine cargo operations, because that's literally my job. A murmur ran through the assembly, like wind through trees, except the trees were made of aliens and judgment. Eli caught fragments of translated speech from his earpiece. Typical human aggression. They haven't learned. The fringe wars taught them nothing. His jaw clenched. The fringe wars. Always back to that. Like humanity's one mistake defined them forever. Never mind that half the species in this room had their own histories of violence and conquest. The Ethel Dominion had subjugated 6 star systems before humanity even invented the radio. But nobody held that against them anymore because it was ancient history and they'd learned to play the galactic politics game. Humans were still the new kids who'd thrown a tantrum and broken the neighbor's window. The prosecutor was still talking, bringing up more evidence. Testimony from the Crown's captain, given days before the explosion, noting that the human cargo hauler had seemed agitated and suspicious. Financial records showing Eli had received an unusually large payment 3 months ago. Communications intercepts that allegedly showed coded messages, though Eli recognized them as his friend Mara's terrible attempts at flirting via text. Every piece of evidence was circumstantial, but together they painted a picture that even Eli had to admit looked bad. If he'd been sitting up in those tiers, watching some other poor bastard in the spotlight, he might have believed it too. The lead magistrate, still invisible in the high shadows, spoke again. Does the accused wish to present a defense? The holographic text in front of Eli changed to green. Permission to speak, apparently. He took a breath. His translator unit, a cheap model he bought on a colony world, struggled to keep up with the formal court setting. When he spoke, his words came out slightly delayed, the standard translation probably making him sound slower than he intended. I didn't do this. I delivered medical supplies. Legal cargo, manifested and inspected. I never touched any plasma charges, never had access to the Crown's internal systems, and I sure as hell wouldn't blow up a ship full of peace delegates because I'm not a complete psychopath. The murmur from the assembly this time carried a different tone. Derision, maybe. Or disbelief. The prosecutor's metal surface rippled. Your denial is noted and dismissed. The evidence speaks clearly. Evidence can be faked, Eli shot back, his translator finally catching up to his actual speaking speed. Someone cloned my ship codes. Someone planted that crate. I'm being framed, which I realize sounds exactly like something a guilty person would say, but in this case happens to be true. The magistrate's voice cut through the chamber again. If you were framed, as you claim, who would benefit from your guilt? Eli opened his mouth, then closed it. That was the question, wasn't it? He was nobody. A former soldier turned cargo hauler, scraping by on the margins of legal trade. He had no enemies powerful enough to orchestrate something like this. No one who would gain anything from seeing him executed. I don't know, he admitted, and hated how weak it sounded. The prosecutor made a gesture that might have been satisfaction. The accused cannot provide alternative explanation. Cannot name enemies. Cannot produce evidence of conspiracy. The simplest answer is the correct one: a human, acting on human impulses toward violence, committed an act of terrorism. The chamber erupted in clicks, chirps, whistles, and sounds that Eli's translator didn't even attempt to render. The consensus was building, he could feel it. They were going to convict him. Right here, right now, without even pretending to deliberate. The magistrate raised something, a staff or gavel that glowed in the darkness, and the crowd fell silent again. The tribunal finds the evidence sufficient for judgment. Elias Thorne, you are hereby. Stop. The word cut through the chamber like a blade through silk. Every head turned. Every eye followed the source of that voice. And Eli, despite everything, despite the chains and the fear and the certainty of his impending execution, felt his heart skip a beat for an entirely different reason. The silence that followed that single word was absolute. Eli had been in decompression chambers that felt less suffocating. Every being in the courtroom seemed to freeze, as if time itself had decided to take a cigarette break and think things over. The woman descended from an observation deck Eli hadn't even noticed, one reserved for the kind of people who didn't sit with the common representatives. She moved without any visible means of propulsion, just a smooth glide through the air that suggested technology so advanced it didn't bother showing off. Her robes caught the light and threw it back in colors that shouldn't exist, shifting between deep violet and something that his brain interpreted as expensive. But it was her face that held him. She looked human. Completely, utterly human, except for the ears. They swept back from her temples in elegant curves, longer than any human's, tapering to points that emerged from her dark hair like something from ancient mythology. Those ears marked her as Ethel, and if the gasps rippling through the assembly were any indication, not just any Ethel. She landed on the courtroom floor with the kind of grace that came from never having to worry about gravity unless it suited her. The prosecutor backed up 3 steps, his metal surface going absolutely still. Even the Ketheric guards along the walls straightened to attention. Eli just stared. His brain was trying to process several things at once and failing at all of them. First, that someone had actually interrupted his execution. Second, that this someone was clearly important enough that interrupting executions was apparently allowed. Third, that she was walking toward him with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing and had already calculated 17 steps ahead. The chains around his wrists suddenly went dark. The energy field collapsed, and his hands were free for the first time in 6 hours. He rubbed his wrists automatically, still staring at the woman who now stood beside him. This close, he could see that her eyes were a shade of amber that definitely didn't occur in baseline human genetics. She turned to face the assembly, and when she spoke, her voice carried without any visible amplification. I am Valith, second daughter of the Ethel Dominion, bearer of the 7th crown, and representative of my people to this tribunal. I invoke the right of protection over this human. He will not be judged here today. The chamber exploded. Not literally, though for a moment Eli thought that might have been less chaotic. Voices erupted from every tier, translators working overtime to render dozens of languages into incomprehensible noise. The prosecutor's metal surface rippled like a disturbed pond. Several representatives were on their feet, if they had feet, shouting what were probably objections. The magistrate's glowing staff came down 3 times before order reasserted itself. When the voice from the shadows spoke again, it carried an edge that hadn't been there before. Princess Valith. The right of protection has not been invoked in this tribunal for 70 years. You understand the implications? I understand them perfectly, Valith said, her tone suggesting she found the question mildly insulting. I also understand the evidence presented against this human is circumstantial at best and politically convenient at worst. I will not stand by while this assembly rushes to judgment. Eli's translator was working overtime now, but he caught the phrase, politically convenient, and filed it away for later panic. Later, when he wasn't standing next to an alien princess who'd apparently decided he was worth protecting for reasons he absolutely could not fathom. He leaned slightly toward her, keeping his voice low. Not that I'm ungrateful, but who are you and why are you doing this? Because I'm about 90% sure we've never met, and I definitely would have remembered. Valeth didn't look at him, but he caught the tiniest twitch at the corner of her mouth. You'd be surprised what you don't remember. The prosecutor had recovered enough to speak. Princess, with respect, the evidence is clear. This human's vessel made contact with the destroyed ship. His codes were used. His movement patterns suggest premeditation. Your protection, however well-intentioned, cannot change facts. Facts, Valeth repeated, and somehow made the word sound like an insult. Facts can be manufactured. Data can be falsified. I've seen enough frame jobs in my career to recognize one when it's this obvious. A Voshan representative in the lower tiers stood, her crystalline form catching the light. The princess suggests conspiracy without evidence. This is irregular. What's irregular, Valeth countered, turning to face the speaker, is convicting someone without a proper investigation. What's irregular is accepting a narrative that conveniently blames a human for an attack that benefits specific political interests in this chamber. Shall we discuss who profits from the failure of the Korvax Peace Summit? Because I have a list and it's fascinating reading. The silence that followed was different from before. This one had teeth. Eli watched representatives exchange glances, some nervous, some calculating. Whatever Valeth had just implied, it had landed like a bomb in calm water. The magistrate spoke carefully. You make serious accusations, Princess. I make observations, Valeth said. And I invoke my right to investigate this matter personally. The human will be released into my custody during the investigation period. Standard protocol. Absolutely not, the prosecutor said, his first show of actual emotion. The human is a flight risk. He has no ties to this station, no reason to remain once released. He has me, Valeth said simply. I guarantee his presence. If he flees, I forfeit my standing in this tribunal and face the same charges he does. That should be sufficient. Eli's brain finally caught up with what was happening. She was betting her entire position on him. A human she claimed not to know, or at least hadn't explained how she knew. He wanted to ask what the hell she was thinking, but the energy in the room suggested that speaking right now would be a fantastically bad idea. The magistrate conferred with others in the shadows. Eli couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could imagine it. The politics alone must be incredible. Ethel Dominion was one of the major powers. You didn't just dismiss their princess's demands without serious consideration. Finally, the voice returned. The tribunal will allow it. The human Elias Thorne is released into Princess Valeth's custody pending further investigation. He will remain on this station. He will report daily to tribunal security. If he fails to appear, or if he attempts to flee, Princess Valeth will face charges of obstruction and conspiracy. These terms are not negotiable. Accepted, Valeth said immediately. Eli wanted to object that maybe someone should ask him if he accepted, but honestly, anything was better than the execution he'd been facing 30 seconds ago. He'd take his chances with the mysterious alien princess who apparently thought protecting him was worth risking her own neck. The prosecutor started to say something else, but Valeth was already turning away, her robes swirling with that impossible color. She looked at Eli for the first time since landing, really looked at him, and something flickered in those amber eyes. Recognition? Amusement? He couldn't tell. Come, she said. We have much to discuss, and I'd prefer to do it somewhere without an audience. She started walking toward a side exit that Eli hadn't noticed before. He glanced back at the assembly, at the hundreds of aliens watching him with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage to something that might have been fear. The Kethric guards made no move to stop him. Eli Thorne, cargo hauler and apparently someone worth protecting by alien royalty, followed the princess out of the courtroom. As the doors closed behind them, he heard the chamber erupt into argument again, but it was already distant. He caught up to Valeth in the corridor beyond. She was moving with purpose, clearly knowing exactly where she was going. Okay, Eli said. I need answers. Starting with how you know me, because I've got a pretty good memory for faces and I've definitely never met an Ethel princess before. Valeth glanced at him, and this time she definitely smiled. You kept your promise, Eli Thorne. Even when you didn't remember making it. Then she turned a corner, leaving him to follow and wonder what the hell that meant. Valetha's quarters made Eli's entire ship look like a storage closet. The main room alone could have housed his cargo bay twice over, with walls that seemed to shift between solid and transparent depending on what angle you looked at them. Through one section he could see the curve of the station's outer ring, stars drifting past in lazy rotation. Through another, what looked like a waterfall flowing upward into a ceiling that might not actually exist. He stood in the entrance, suddenly very aware that he was still wearing a detention jumpsuit that smelled like 6 hours of stress sweat and poor life choices. Valeth moved through the space like she owned it, which technically she probably did. She gestured at something and furniture materialized. Not holographic, Eli realized as he touched the chair that appeared beside him. Actual solid matter, just stored in some format his brain couldn't process until it was needed. Sit, she said. It wasn't quite a command, but it wasn't really a suggestion either. Eli sat. The chair adjusted itself to his body with the kind of comfort that came from technology that cost more than his ship. He tried not to think about whether he was leaving sweat stains on alien royalty's furniture. Valeth remained standing, and now that they were alone, he could see her properly. She was tall, taller than most human women, with the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of people getting out of your way. Her hair was dark enough to be black but caught light like it was threaded with something metallic. And those ears, rising from her temples in elegant points, were impossible not to stare at even though he knew it was probably rude. She caught him looking and raised one eyebrow. The gesture was so perfectly human that it threw him. You have questions, she said. I have about 700 questions, Eli replied. But let's start with the big one. Who am I to you and why did you just risk everything to pull me out of that courtroom? Valeth finally sat, choosing a chair that formed across from him. She studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes taking in details he couldn't guess at. Then she leaned back, and for the first time since he'd seen her, she looked almost relaxed. 5 years ago, she said, during what you call the Fringe Wars, I was on a diplomatic mission to the Outer Territories. My ship suffered a catastrophic drive failure in what you humans had designated as contested space. We were dead in the water, as your people say, and broadcasting distress signals that no one was answering because the area was too hot with conflict. Eli's memory stirred, pulling up fragments he'd buried under 3 years of trying to forget the war. Contested space. Patrol routes. The constant background radiation of paranoia that came from knowing every sensor contact could be hostile. Your military vessel found us, Valeth continued. A frigate, I believe you called it. The Tenacious. Your commanding officer wanted to either destroy us or take me hostage. The Ethel Dominion had not yet chosen sides in your war, and he saw an opportunity. The Tenacious. Eli remembered that ship. Remembered the captain, a man named Sorens who'd had more ambition than sense and a trigger finger that itched every time something looked at him wrong. Eli had been junior officer then, responsible for sensor operations and generally keeping his head down. There was a junior officer, Valeth said, watching his face. He argued against both options. Pointed out that taking an Ethel princess hostage would guarantee the Dominion would side against humanity. That destroying my ship would have the same result. He advocated for letting us go, claimed we drifted into their patrol zone by accident and that interfering would bring consequences their losing war couldn't afford. Eli's memory was filling in the gaps now. He remembered the argument on the bridge. Remembered Sorens getting in his face, calling him a coward and a traitor. Remembered standing his ground because the alternative was starting a conflict with a civilization that could glass Earth from orbit without breaking a sweat. The officer was overruled, Valeth said. But while his captain was planning his next move, that officer accessed the navigation systems. He sent my ship the current patrol schedules, highlighted the gaps in your fleet's coverage, and gave us a window to escape. Then he falsified the sensor logs to make it look like we jumped away before your ship arrived. Eli rubbed his face. That was stupid. I could have been court-martialed. You should have been, Valeth agreed. But you were careful. And lucky. Your captain never discovered the deception. My ship escaped, and the Dominion remained neutral for another 3 months before the war's outcome became inevitable. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and for a moment she looked less like a princess and more like someone who'd carried a weight for too long. You saved my life, Elias Thorne. You saved my crew. And you did it knowing you'd gain nothing from it except the satisfaction of doing what you believed was right. That kind of integrity is rare enough in any species. Among humans, in the middle of a war you were losing, it was extraordinary. Eli wanted to say it wasn't that extraordinary. That he'd just been trying to prevent an even bigger disaster. That he'd been terrified the whole time and had nightmares about Soren's finding out for months afterward. But the way Valeth was looking at him suggested she wouldn't buy the false modesty. So you've been tracking me, he said instead. For 5 years. Waiting for a chance to return the favor. I've been keeping watch, Valeth corrected. There's a difference. I wanted to know what became of the human who chose wisdom over vengeance. I watched you leave the military after the war. Watched you buy that terrible cargo hauler. Watched you struggle to make a living in a galaxy that doesn't trust your species. It's not that terrible, Eli said, defensive about his ship despite everything. The Drifter's luck has character. It has structural problems and an engine that sounds like it's dying, Valeth said, but there was warmth in her voice. But you've kept it flying, and you've kept yourself out of trouble. Until 2 weeks ago. The reminder of his current situation landed like cold water. I didn't sabotage that ship. I know. You know. Just like that. Valeth stood and walked to one of the transparent walls. With a gesture, she brought up a holographic display that made the tribunal's evidence presentation look like a child's toy. Data streams flowed through the air, three-dimensional representations of ship movements, communications logs, and sensor readings. I know because I spent the last week investigating every detail of the case against you. I have resources the tribunal doesn't, and I'm not bound by their procedural limitations. She pulled up an image of his ship docked with the diplomatic vessel. Your codes were used, yes. But look at the transmission signature. She highlighted something in the data that looked like noise to Eli's untrained eye. This is your ship's actual identifier, buried in the carrier wave. Every vessel has one, nearly impossible to fake because it's generated by quantum fluctuations in the jump drive. Now look at this. Another window appeared, showing the same docking procedure but with different highlighting. This is the identifier from the log submitted as evidence. Similar, but not identical. Someone cloned your codes but couldn't replicate the quantum signature perfectly. They were counting on no one looking that deep. Eli stared at the display, understanding maybe a quarter of what he was seeing but getting the general idea. Someone went through a lot of trouble to frame me. Why? I'm nobody. That, Valeth said, turning back to him, is what we need to discover. Because you're right. You're not important enough to frame unless framing you serves a larger purpose. The real question is what that purpose might be. She dismissed the display with a wave. The tribunal gave us 7 days. In that time, we need to find out who actually destroyed Serenity's crown, why they did it, and why they wanted you to take the fall. If we can't, you'll be back in that courtroom and my protection won't be enough to save you. No pressure then, Eli said. He meant it as a joke, but it came out flatter than intended. Valetha's expression softened slightly. I didn't save you from execution just to let you walk back into it. We'll find the truth. But I need you to tell me everything about your movements over the past month. Every cargo run, every stop, every person you interacted with. Something in there is the key. Eli nodded slowly. His brain was still processing the fact that an alien princess had been watching over him for 5 years because of a decision he'd made in the heat of war. That she'd tracked his mediocre career as a cargo hauler and decided he was worth saving. That she apparently believed in him more than he believed in himself. "All right," he said. "But first, can I ask one more question?" 1. Do you have a shower I could use? Because I've been in these clothes for 6 hours and I'm pretty sure I'm violating several station hygiene protocols. Valeth laughed. It was a real laugh, unexpected and genuine, and it transformed her face from regal to something almost mischievous. "Through that archway. The controls are intuitive. Don't touch the green settings unless you're prepared for ethyl traditional cleansing. It involves ions." Eli stood, already heading for the archway. "I'm just going to stick with water and soap, thanks. Save the ions for someone who knows what they're doing." "Eli," Valeth called as he reached the threshold. He turned back. She was regarding him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I'm glad you kept your promise. Even if you didn't remember making it." He wanted to ask what promise she meant. Instead, he just nodded and went to make himself presentable for whatever came next. The shower had helped, but the clean clothes Valeth had provided helped more. They fit perfectly, which bothered Eli until he realized she'd probably scanned him the moment he walked into her quarters. The fabric was some kind of adaptive material that felt like cotton but regulated temperature better than any human textile he'd worn. He suspected it cost more than everything he owned. When he emerged, Valeth had transformed the main room into what looked like a command center. Holographic displays floated in clusters, each one showing different data streams. She stood in the middle of it all, hands moving through the air as she manipulated information with the kind of fluid grace that suggested she'd been doing this her entire life. She glanced at him. "Better? Much. I feel almost human again." "Well, as human as someone can feel while wearing clothes that probably have more computing power than my ship's navigation system." "They're just clothes," Valeth said, but her mouth twitched. "Now, walk me through your cargo runs. Start with 3 months ago." Eli moved closer to the displays, watching data scroll past in languages he couldn't read. 3 months ago I was hauling agricultural equipment to the Deneb colonies. Standard run, nothing unusual. Took 2 weeks including layovers. Valeth pulled up his flight logs, cross-referencing them with station records. "You received a large payment after that run. 40,000 credits. That's what the tribunal flagged as suspicious." "That wasn't from the cargo run," Eli explained. "That was my bonus from a contract I'd completed the month before. Medical supplies to Outpost Kepler." The colony administrator was so grateful for getting the shipment on time that he threw in extra. Those supplies were for a disease outbreak. Getting them late would have meant people dying. She nodded, making notes in her system. "Next run." They worked through his schedule methodically. Valeth's questions were precise, digging into details Eli hadn't thought were important. Who had he talked to at each station? What had he carried? Had anyone shown unusual interest in his ship or his routes? An hour passed. Then 2. Eli's initial nervousness faded as he got caught up in the investigation. There was something almost comfortable about working with Valeth. She listened without judgment, challenged his assumptions without making him feel stupid, and occasionally cracked jokes dry enough that it took him a moment to realize she was being funny. "So the Vashan dock worker tried to charge you extra for parking," she said at one point, reviewing his stop at Gateway Station. "Tried and succeeded," Eli corrected. "I'm not great at negotiating with crystalline beings who can literally see my stress levels through bioluminescence." Note to self, Valeth murmured. "Don't send Eli to negotiate treaties. I'm standing right here. I'm aware." They were reviewing his stop at Helix Station 2 weeks ago, the routine permit renewal that should have been unremarkable, when Valeth froze. Her hand stopped moving through the holographic displays. Her ears, which Eli had learned were remarkably expressive, tilted forward in a way that suggested intense focus. "What?" Eli asked. "Your permit renewal." "Who processed it?" Eli thought back. "Some bureaucrat. I don't remember his name." "Species with the tentacle faces?" "Lots of them work administration." "Quellen," Valeth said absently, already pulling up records. "Did he do anything unusual?" "He took forever. I was there for 3 hours when it should have taken 30 minutes. Kept saying the system was slow, that there were verification issues with my registry." Valeth's fingers flew through the data. "He accessed your ship's identification codes during that process. Full deep system scan, completely unnecessary for a simple permit renewal." The implications hit Eli like a cold wave. "He copied my codes. Not just copied. He had time to clone them perfectly, or near perfectly. Enough to fool standard security checks." She pulled up personnel records, and a face appeared in the holographic display. The Quellen bureaucrat, looking bored and official in his identification photo. "His name is Vecker. He's worked station administration for 8 years. Completely unremarkable record. Until someone paid him to steal ship codes," Eli finished. Valeth was already diving deeper, pulling financial records that Eli suspected she wasn't technically supposed to have access to. Then again, being a princess probably came with certain privileges regarding privacy laws. "There," she said, highlighting a transaction. "Vecker received 50,000 credits 3 days before your permit renewal. Routed through 6 different accounts to obscure the source, but the ultimate origin is a trade consortium called the Meridian Group. Never heard of them. Most people haven't. They're a shell company, but dig deep enough and you find connections to weapons manufacturing, security contracts, and several board members who have significant investments in military industries." Eli was starting to see the shape of it. The Peace Summit. If those delegates had succeeded, if the Korvax conflict had been resolved peacefully, Meridian Group would have lost billions in contracts, Valeth finished. They've been supplying both sides of that conflict for 2 years. Peace is very bad for their profit margins. She pulled up more data, showing the web of connections. Board members, subsidiary companies, financial transfers that painted a picture of systematic corruption. And there, buried in the middle of it all, was a name Eli recognized from the tribunal. "The prosecutor," he said. "The one who presented evidence against me." Valeth nodded grimly. "Not directly employed by Meridian, but his previous 3 cases all involved outcomes that benefited their interests. I suspect he's been taking payments for years, though proving it would be difficult. So they needed a scapegoat," Eli said, the pieces falling into place. "Someone to blame for the bombing. And the human was perfect because everyone already expects humans to be violent." "You were convenient," Valeth agreed. "Solitary, no powerful connections, flying routes that made you easy to frame. They stole your codes, planted the bomb under your identification, and counted on the tribunal's existing prejudice to do the rest." Eli sat down heavily in the nearest chair. 17 people died because someone wanted to protect their profit margin. "Yes." Valeth's voice was quiet but carried an edge of anger that made Eli glad he wasn't on the receiving end. "And they almost got away with it." She started copying data, compiling everything into a format that could be presented to the tribunal. "This is enough to clear you. Vecker's access to your codes, the financial trail to Meridian, the prosecutor's conflict of interest. We can prove conspiracy. Will they listen?" Eli asked. "The tribunal already decided I was guilty." "They'll listen," Valeth said with absolute certainty. "Because I'm going to make it very clear that if they don't, the Ethel Dominion will be extremely interested in investigating why a conspiracy that benefits multiple tribunal members was nearly overlooked." She sent the compiled evidence package with a gesture, and somewhere in the station's bureaucratic machinery, wheels began turning. Eli watched her work, this alien princess who'd saved him because of a decision he barely remembered making. 5 years she'd watched over him, waiting for a chance to repay a debt he hadn't known existed. And when that chance came, she'd risked everything without hesitation. "Thank you," he said quietly. Valeth looked at him, really looked at him, and her expression softened. "You gave me my life when you had every reason not to. When doing so put you at risk. This is simply returning the favor, though I admit the circumstances are more complicated than I'd anticipated." "Is it always this complicated with you?" "Usually more so," she admitted. "You should consider yourself fortunate." The holographic displays chimed. A message had arrived, official tribunal seal. Valeth opened it, read quickly, and smiled. "They've issued an immediate stay of judgment and opened a formal investigation into Meridian Group. You're cleared, Eli. Officially." The relief that washed through him was so intense he felt dizzy. 3 days of terror, of knowing he was going to die for something he didn't do, and it was over. Just like that. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you're free to go," Valeth said. "Back to your ship, back to running cargo. Back to your life." Eli stood, suddenly uncertain. "And you?" "I have a conspiracy to unravel and several tribunal members to make very uncomfortable," she said. "Standard princess duties." He wanted to say something meaningful, something that captured the enormity of what she'd done for him. Instead, what came out was, "If you ever need cargo hauled, I offer a friends and family discount." Valeth laughed, that same genuine sound from before. "I'll keep that in mind. Though I suspect you'll want to avoid the Helix Tribunal for a while. At least until the scandal dies down." "Sounds like a plan." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Valeth? That promise you mentioned. The one I kept without remembering?" She tilted her head, ears shifting in what he'd learned was curiosity. "You told me, 5 years ago when you sent those patrol schedules, that you were doing it because some debts transcend politics. That kindness should be repaid with kindness. I'm simply following your advice." Eli smiled. "I sound wiser than I remember being." "You were terrified and trying very hard to seem confident," Valeth said. "But the wisdom was real." He nodded, accepting that, and walked toward the door. It opened before he reached it, sensing his intention. "Eli," Valeth called. He turned back one last time. "Try to stay out of trouble." "I'll do my best," he promised. "Though given my track record, no guarantees." He left her quarters and made his way through the station toward the docks where the drifter's luck waited. The corridors felt different now, less oppressive. Or maybe he just felt different, knowing he wasn't walking toward his execution. When he reached his ship, battered and familiar and home, he found a message waiting in his communications log. From Valeth, sent just moments ago. It contained coordinates for a supply run, a very generous payment offer, and a single line of text, "In case you need work. Friends and family rates accepted." Eli Thorne, cargo hauler and apparently friend to alien royalty, smiled and began plotting his next course.